we say King George, and you're pretty close to being right about that. We sometimes call it the Georgian period. Now, if we could see some of these slides. Here is an old, if you could move back to the previous one. One more back, that's right. Yeah, this is the pedestal for an old market cross that used to be there in Epworth in Lincolnshire. When we were living in Britain in the 70s, we went up to Epworth and we actually stayed in the old rectory where John Wesley had lived. And there's a plaque on this pedestal saying that John Wesley actually preached on that pedestal at one point. It used to have a cross on top of it, and the cross has long since fallen down, but the pedestal is there. It marks where they would have gatherings like a fair or a market day in the middle of town, and John Wesley preached on that site. We could have the next slide. The next slide shows you the old rectory in Lincolnshire. Now, the building is not as crooked as it looks there. It's actually quite straight. The problem is, back in the 1970s, I was using a medium called slides, right? Photographic slides. And the slides, you know, I took and then had them digitized, but I took one slide of one end of the house and one slide of the other end of the house and then had to stitch them together. So the wavering is due to the stitchery. But there's a nice Georgian-looking house. This building was built in 1709 after a fire destroyed the previous rectory that was there. The fire was in 1708, and you may know the story that John Wesley was in one of the upper bedrooms. Samuel and his wife got out. Samuel, very, very scholarly man and very pious man, but not a very practical man. They hear that John is streaming from one of the upper floor bedrooms, and so what did Samuel do? He prayed. Yeah, but other men with a somewhat more practical bent sort of formed a human ladder and were able to get John out of that. And Susanna commented, using a passage of Scripture, that you are as a brand plucked from the burning. And that becomes one of John Wesley's mottos. He will put that at the bottom of his seal, a brand plucked from the burning. Maybe like he thought God had saved him for some particular task. We actually spent the night in one of the upper bedrooms, the one right up above the door there. John Wesley talked about a poltergeist, you know, this kind of ghost that makes noises at night. And we actually heard noises in the night in the rectory there. But when we got up the next morning, the keeper explained that it was his daughter coming in from a date. So I guess it wasn't a ghost named Jeffrey that they talked about. We could have the next slide. Here is a view looking from Samuel Wesley's study toward the church. And you can't really see the church here. What you can see is some chicken sheds that have been built since John Wesley's time. But Samuel Wesley was basically a scholar. He had 18 children and he wouldn't be bothered by them. He basically sat there writing Latin commentaries on the book of Job, a huge book that he got his boys to help him with. Very scholarly, nerdy kind of guy. And he raised 3 nerdy sons as well as a few nerdy daughters. All the daughters were taught not only how to read, but they were taught some Latin and Greek as well. So very well-educated family, but a poor family, oddly enough. So if we could have the next slide. Here is Samuel Wesley's tombstone. You can see there where it says the Reverend Samuel Wesley in the churchyard of St. Andrew's Church, where Samuel Wesley had served as the rector of that Anglican congregation. One time when John Wesley came to Epworth and people in Epworth wanted to hear him preach after he had become a famous evangelist, the pastor of the church would not allow him to preach in the church, so he stood on his father's tombstone and preached. And he said they surely couldn't deny him the right to do that. So every Methodist who comes to Epworth wants to do what? Stand on his tomb. And that's a problem because it's going to crack. So now it's kind of fenced around so that you can't actually get to it and stand on it. But one of the remembrances of them. We could advance to the next slide.